Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Spilling the Beans, Coffee and Conversation with Patient Advocates. I'm Sarah, and I'm so excited to be here with this amazing group of people that have not only lived incredible journeys, but have also put their stories into books to share with the world. Before we dive in, just a really quick reminder, nothing that you hear today is medical advice. We're not promoting any kind of products or manufacturers, and please always talk to your physician before trying anything new. All right, so let's get started and meet our advocates. I'd like if we could just go around and have each of you introduce yourselves. If you're comfortable, share where you're from, the name of your book, your social media handles, how long you've been a patient advocate, and of course, what hot drink is in your cup today. You can start with Marisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marisa, native New Yorker, currently living in the Carolinas, and I am having my chai tea today, which is my favorite. I advocate for lupus and autoimmune disease. I've been doing that for about 20 years, and you can find me at Lupus Chick Official on Instagram, Lupus Chick on Facebook. And I've been in the world of writing for over 20 years, probably 25 now. First as a journalist, a health journalist, and then I got into ghostwriting books, writing my own books, and then helping people write their books because I feel like everyone has at least one book inside of them. And I also work as a literary agent, so helping people get book deals.
I am Kody Coleman. I was diagnosed with a ultra rare stage 4 kidney cancer in December of 2020 as a newlywed as well. So I actually didn't have a writing background or anything before I published my book. I decided to write my book to be able to share a transparent look of what it was like to be diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer at a very young age. So that is the reason kind of why I decided to publish a book. And I'm excited to learn from everybody else on the call because we have very different experiences and I think it'll be great.
My name's Kody Green. I am a schizophrenia patient advocate. I started sharing my story about living with schizophrenia on social media about 7 years ago. And this is my first experience with writing a book. My book's called Minds Over Meetings. It's specifically about mental health and mental illness in the workplace. So instead of doing a more broad overview of my story, I chose to do a niche about something I'm really passionate about. This is not only my first time publishing a book, I never really planned on being an author or going down that route. So it's definitely a really interesting thing for me to be able to talk about, especially that, it's so recent for me. And my drink is not hot or in a mug, but I do have my coffee mixed with my protein shake here.
Great. All right, so all of you kind of briefly touched on this, but I'd love to hear a little bit just about what that deciding factor was that made you sit down and say, I'm going to write a book. This is my next step. And if each of you could contribute, that would be great. Kody, do you want to start?
Sure. So I would say for me, I always figured that I would write a book about my experience with my journey through my schizophrenia diagnosis and also having grown up as someone who was a caregiver for my mother with schizoaffective disorder. Most of my life has been revolved around this diagnosis and around this illness. And so I had a lot that I wanted to talk about, a lot I wanted to share. So as soon as I started advocacy, I figured that eventually I would, take a part of my story and be able to publish it so people could learn more about my experience. I didn't really plan on doing more of a book about a specific topic or anything, but that's just what I ended up doing because in the time I was publishing and the time I was writing it, that's the topic that spoke to me the most. And, it was post-COVID. Mental health in the workplace was a really important topic at that point. And so that's what I decided to take advantage of and try to use a portion of my story to continue spreading awareness.
So I've always loved storytelling, which is, I think, why I sort of veered towards journalism. And I always loved people's stories. So when they would send me out in the community and be able to share other people's stories, it just fueled this passion in me. And then once I started Lupus Chick and advocacy, I knew that I eventually wanted to put my story on paper, but I felt like it was still percolating and it just wasn't ready yet. So over the years, I noticed that a lot of people that would message me had very similar questions. And so I started putting those down into a format because instead of just typing a really long answer every single time, I was able to sort of go back to my notes. And I saw it happening over and over again for years. And I just felt like, okay, it's definitely getting ready to be time to put this into a book so that I can say, like, here's sort of your journey and your survival guide to living with lupus and this autoimmune disease diagnosis. And it has like every topic you could think of, from work and romantic relationships and just your self-confidence and everything that chronic illness touches, all in one book. And then I got a ghostwriting job out of New York City, and that really taught me the process of how to write a book, which in my brain is almost very mathematical in a sense. And I was able to do that a few times, and I feel like that gave me, I guess, the inspiration, but also the courage of just like, okay, now I feel prepared to be able to put this down on paper. And so Chronically Fabulous was born, and that came out in 2020, which was during COVID. So it's kind of a crazy time for books. But yeah, that sort of just fueled it all and started it. And then since then, I've just been working with people because they have such incredible stories. Like, I love memoir and I love nonfiction because I feel like people's lives are just wild. That's why we have fiction, but there's some people's stories that are just, equally, or if not more, really need to be shared and out there. And I feel like that storytelling not only gives us more awareness for people and educates the public who maybe would have never read about like that disease, but I feel like it increases empathy. And I have a great passion for people to tell their stories.
Yeah. So for me, I kind of had a very similar journey as far as sharing on social media first. So when I was initially diagnosed, I was diagnosed, as I had mentioned, as a 29-year-old newlywed with a ultra rare stage 4 cancer. I had over 15 tumors and my prognosis didn't look great at the time. And when I was diagnosed, it was still kind of in this phase where not a lot of people were sharing cancer diagnoses kind of openly. I think over the past few years that it's become a lot more common. But at the time, I couldn't find any stories of especially young women who had ever faced stage 4 kidney cancer, which is what I was facing. And so I started sharing on social media because I felt hopeless. I had no idea what to expect. And I just wanted anybody else that might come behind me to have at least a different perspective, or somebody who might have left some breadcrumbs behind about what it was like for them. And as I was going through that process, so many crazy things happened along the way. As mentioned, everybody kind of has a story, right? I think all of our lives have these pieces that don't always go according to plan. And I definitely had a lot of those through my diagnosis. And each time I was navigating them, again, what felt like completely alone. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know what to look for. I felt alone because at the time, all of the language around battling cancer was about being a survivor and being strong and being resilient. And I felt weak and scared. And so I actually had somebody suggest to me as I was sharing through social media at one point of, you should write a book one day because of kind of how everything transpired. And so as I got further into my diagnosis and into advocacy, I decided to write a book to share that very transparent and kind of real and vulnerable side, all of the difficult parts, to help others feel less alone, but then also to raise money for research. So I donated my book deal to help move research forward and help pay for part of a grant for a rare type of kidney cancer. So that was my motivation.
Katie, this next one comes from John Reyes. He's the AKA the Parkinson's runner. And John asks, many people with chronic illnesses feel that they have a story to tell, but they don't know where to start. How did you decide what parts of your journey to include and what to leave out? And were there any personal boundaries that you set, and how did you set those before you started writing?
So it's a great question. And I think it's one that I think prevents a lot of people from starting writing or getting a book out. I remember I probably stopped and started at least 4 or 5 times before I actually kind of committed to writing a book. And that was because I originally just started I wanted to journal out what my experience was. I shared on social media, but you only get a snippet of what those experiences are like. So I started from the very beginning and was like, okay, day 1 of my diagnosis. And then I started writing and I found myself in a position where I was like, okay, there's so much context that led up to that moment. So now I need to go backwards a bunch. And what do I include so that the reader doesn't feel lost, but then also doesn't get my entire life story in the process? And so what I ended up landing on is I eventually just kind of decided, okay, I am going to write a book. I'm just going to write 1,000 words a day is kind of what I was aiming for, kind of in the sprint that was trying to get me motivated. And for me, it didn't matter what I wrote. Like, If I found a topic that was difficult to share on, I moved to a different topic. And I knew that at the end, I could decide how I wanted to reconstruct those and put them in the order that makes sense. But I just started writing anything and everything. And then I personally had a separate Word document that was called the cutting room floor that I just dropped sections into as I decided, okay, this wasn't really relevant. I'll drop it into this section here. And that was super, super helpful for me as well, too, once it came to the editing process.
Kody, Marisa, do you have any other kinds of stories you'd like to relay to about what it was like to cull and choose what to include?
Yeah, I do. I can jump in. It's definitely a question I feel like I hear a lot, especially like in the book world, how much do you put in? And I've only learned through like Katie writing my own book and helping people write their books. Like you won't be able to fit everything inside your book. There's absolutely just no way. And I think it also depends on, are you going for like a straight memoir? Are you going more for like a nonfiction self-help book? There's hybrid memoirs. Those are my favorite. Those are really popular, especially I think in the chronic illness community, because it weaves our own story in it. And that is the thread that goes through the book, but it also teaches people things. So they might pull in like psychology or science or, food facts or religion or whatever it is that makes sense with their story. So I'm a big fan of brain dumping and sort of just putting everything out and then thinking about what is my goal for the book? What is the journey that I want the book to take? I always tell people to kind of have an elevator speech. If someone said, what is this book about that you're writing? You should be able to answer that in, a 10-second format. And then that's sort of your umbrella, and whatever doesn't really fit under that or is going to pull the reader away and take them down a different path, I would cut that out. And this is, it's not a bad thing. I know that people feel like they have to share everything, but an average book is 40, 50,000 words these days. So you can use that material later for a follow-up book and maybe a different type of book. I think one, like what is the journey of the book? But also I always tell people when they're just about to start, because it could be so overwhelming just looking at a blank screen or a blank notepad, I tell them to pick a couple people they know in their life. Like I had people that I thought about that were just getting diagnosed. And then I had people that were 10 years into the diagnosis, different backgrounds, different religions. And I thought to myself, every time I would sit down and write, how can I make this relatable that the person that's newly diagnosed is getting something out of it? And also someone that's 10 or 15 years in is also going to walk away and feel like, I'm better off now for reading this, and I was able to take things away from it.
So Marisa, our next question comes from Reka, a lupus patient and advocate. And Reka asks, for those who may not consider themselves strong writers, do you think that should hold someone back from telling their story?
No, definitely not. I mean, there's all types of writers. And I mean, even though I've been technically writing for over 25 years, I'm a pretty simple writer. We tend to write the way that we speak. And then there's, some real literary writers that is a certain audience that wants to read that type of writing. I say get your story down on paper, do the best job that you can, and team up with either a developmental editor. There's a million book editors out there, book coaches. They can help you strengthen certain areas. I mean, that's their job. That's what they do. And here's the thing. You can have this incredible story and a story that can change people's lives. Get it down on paper. If you want to go the route of getting a traditional book deal, if a publisher picks you up, they have an entire team of editors that is going to work on your book anyway. So I wouldn't let that stop you, because it's going to be polished through the whole book writing process. And even if you want to self-publish, that's fine too. I would just say partner with a really strong editor. You'd be surprised, like they don't really change that much, because they want your voice to be the voice that comes out on the paper to the reader. It's not their book, it's yours. But I definitely wouldn't get stuck and stop in your tracks just because you think that you're not good enough. I think in any creative endeavor, whether it's writing or painting or whatnot, we always question ourselves, but other people don't see us the way that we see us.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. As far as I'm somebody who did not have a writing background at all. I hadn't really written anything other than my social media posts prior to my book, and I didn't consider myself a strong writer. Writing to this day is still one of the hardest things that I've done. I often say that publishing my book was by far one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And that's because it was a lot of work and really hard for me to write. I'm a software engineer by trade. I can throw up an entire platform in a day, but to get me to write 500 words and consolidate my story into that kind of compact narrative was really, really hard for me. So I did publish a book, and I also traditionally published a book. And so I very much agree and want to kind of echo it's really important that you just find your story, and the writing piece will work its way out. Definitely do not be worried about making sure that it's super polished, especially on your first draft. What you're really trying to get out is your story. And I can't say enough good things about my editors who really did help me craft that. I know we talked just briefly, as well as find kind of the umbrella of your story and like know what your elevator pitch is. I actually didn't quite have my elevator pitch. Even as I was like halfway through my book, there were so many other places my book could have gone. And I wasn't quite sure what the end result would be. I knew the overarching story that I wanted to share and the main things I wanted people to get out of the book. And so I just kept writing those. And then by the time the book was finished, for me, that's when it was very clear of like, here's the arc. And then a publisher really helped me refine that. So I just wanted to share that is I think understanding like your why, who you want to read it, what you want for them to get out of it can be really helpful if you're still also trying to figure out what that elevator pitch kind of is.
Kody, we had a question from Natalie Hayden, who's a Crohn's patient and advocate, and she talks about how it can be really hard to narrow down a focus to get started. Do you have any advice on for writers that are struggling to identify their angle and their approach to the story, and just how to get started in that first initial writing process?
Yeah, I think what I loved about writing more of a niche part of my story was I knew that, as both Marisa and Katie said, my story wasn't going to fit in one 50,000 word book. Like I have too much lived experience to be able to share everything I want to share. So making my first book something specific, like in this case, mental health and mental illness in the workplace, allowed me to take one portion. And what I was actually worried about was not having enough to write about. And I was very wrong in being worried about that, because even this one aspect of my journey, I had so much to say. And, as someone who's been a patient advocate for years, you realize as you start writing out your story that you have a certain part of the story that you can really expand on. And for me, I chose a topic that I get a lot of questions about. People with mental illness, people with severe disabilities struggle in the workplace. There's a lot that people don't know about their rights as workers. There's a lot that people ask me as a patient advocate, how I've managed to function in quote unquote traditional workplaces for so many years. And so I knew that not only did I have a lot to say about that topic, but people were interested in it. So for me, I really listened to my peers. I wanted to know what they were interested in learning about. Like I said, this was post-COVID, so mental health in the workplace was already a trending topic. And I saw an opportunity to be able to expand on that and really advocate more, not only for just general mental health, but really for mental illness and disability in general. So for me, I relied a lot on my peers and a little bit about what was going on in the world at the time.
Great, thank you so much. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit more about the publishing process, which we started talking a little bit about, because getting your story written is one thing, right? But getting it out into the world is a completely different part of it. So this question is coming from Brady, who's an HIV patient advocate and a U=U pioneer. And Brady wants to know, Marisa, since your career is in publishing, can you highlight the key differences between self-publishing and going through a more traditional publisher?
Yes, absolutely. With traditional publishing, especially with the genre that most of us would write in, which is nonfiction, whether it's a memoir, hybrid memoir, self-help, just general health. The great thing about that with traditional publishing is you can sell it before you even write the entire thing. You can sell it typically with three or four chapters and a book proposal. That might sound really easy, but I will tell you a book proposal is quite an undertaking. I've taught classes just on that. It's a massive document, and basically you are putting together a reason why your book is different than any other book on the shelf and how you're going to market it and why it's needed right now and what the audience is going to get out of it. But one of the great things that I love about book proposals is that it forces you to write a general outline of every chapter, and so that publisher can see the journey of where this book is starting and how it's going to end and what the reader is going to learn, while they're reading it. So you can get an agent, which is a whole process that's in itself, and then start submitting to traditional publishers. There are some smaller and mid-sized publishers that accept unsolicited manuscripts, meaning you don't need a literary agent. So you can, submit to them through their websites. Usually they have a long lead time. You may not hear back for 6 months. But the perks, I think, of traditional publishing, if that's the way you want to go, is sometimes you can get in advance. They obviously help with marketing. They have a team of editors, graphic designers, and they're already in place publishing distribution streams, which helps get your book into different bookstores, airports, things like that. But there's a long lead time, like from initially submitting to shelf, your book may not get out into stores for a good 3 years sometimes. So you have to, want to be patient. And I always tell people, don't write a book because you think that you're going to make millions of dollars. Yes, people do that, and they're the outliers. I think if you have a passion and you want to get your story out there, you want to help people, you love to write or whatever it is, like that's the reason behind it, because people aren't running to traditional publishing to become millionaires. It doesn't work that way. But I've heard that. So I wanted to just throw that out there. There's also hybrid publishing where you pay a small fee to get your book published. And basically you're paying for those services to be done that a traditional publisher would do it for you. So you're paying for someone to edit it and design the book and get it out into the distribution streams. And then there's self-publishing, which I think has a lot of pros, especially today. It's so simple. Like literally anyone can self-publish a book on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, Ingram Sparks, like all of them. They're available now, which these were not available years ago to just the average person. We only had traditional publishing. So the thing with that is all of the costs fall on you. So if you need an editor, you need a book, cover designed, and you have to figure out the program to get your book up. You need it formatted into a file to go onto e-readers and things like that. So you're taking on those costs. But if you are good at marketing, you have a community that you can sell it to, you're also going to reap the benefits of a higher percentage. You might get more close to 70, 80% of your sales price, where if you go with traditional publishing, you're going to fall somewhere between probably 10 and maybe 18% on a good book deal. So you're going to make a lot less too. So I think it really depends on what they're looking for, what their lead time is. If you're a quick writer and you get everything done and you self-publish, you could get that up within 4 to 6 months if you really wanted to. So there's so much that goes into those 3 categories. I think it depends on the person and their situation.
Thank you so much for outlining those. That was really helpful. So Brady and many other advocates want to know, what was your process like for publishing? Did you self-publish it or go through a publisher? Why did you choose that path that you did? And then also, how did you find your publisher if you did go through with the traditional publisher? And what kind of costs were involved? So I'd love to hear about those stories that you had.
I ended up going a traditional publishing route, and I had kind of decided that from initially when I first started kind of writing, and then after maybe not initially as I first started writing, because I just started writing to get the words on paper before I really understood the industry. I will say, publishing is one of the industries that I have found to be one of the most guarded and closed industries. It is really, really, really hard to find information about what the process is, like what normal book sales are, or like the average book sales. Like that's very, very difficult, I found, to find that. And so initially I just started writing. I knew I wanted to get my book out there. I had no idea how long it would take at the time. I was a bit naive, which probably was to my benefit at the beginning to keep me going through it. But once I did decide to publish my book, I knew I wanted to go traditional publishing because I wanted to donate the proceeds from my book back to research. And I knew if I was paying out of pocket, my funds would be much better spent in the majority of cases just donating those funds directly versus trying to publish a book and take the portion of the proceeds to go back to research, largely because I learned along the way how few books the average author does sell. Exactly as Marisa kind of outlined for us, is while there are many people that their books do really well, and they are the outliers. They're the ones you hear about because they are the ones that went really mainstream. But most people kind of just publish books to their community, to the people that their book kind of was immediately intended for, or that they already had an audience for. Especially in traditional publishing, I found that that's part of your pitch, right? Is what kind of marketing platform you already have, so who you're going to sell to. And they do require that you have an audience already in most cases. And so I went the traditional route because I did find it so difficult to try to navigate the space. And I knew I was working full time and running a nonprofit, and I knew there's no chance that I'm going to be able to figure out how to find an editor and all of these other things. My book did get picked up. Additionally, I had to query over 60 agents. And as Marisa mentioned, you kind of talked about the proposal. And that for me was, when I think about that and connecting it to the conversations that we had, that kind of for me is the umbrella, right? So I tried at the beginning to pitch my book before I had finished writing it. But because I mentioned that it was still taking shape, that proposal wasn't really solid. I didn't have that full umbrella. By the end, it did take for me to get all the way through my memoir in order to be able to put that proposal together. I really found that a very helpful piece of information to share with others. But that's the path I took.
I have a very similar experience. I always say that I had zero know-how and a story to tell, and the rest kind of worked itself out from there. For me, I was really lucky in the fact that I have spent years building a social media following. That has always been my main focus. So I now have over 2 million followers across platforms, and I had a really good social media presence. And a publisher actually reached out to me. I had no proposal. I had no ideas. I had only ever thought about writing a book. I had never put anything down on paper. So I kind of have a unique situation where they reached out to me because of my social media following. They said, here are some trending topics in the mental health space. Do any of these appeal to you? I saw mental health and mental illness in the workplace. I knew that was something that a lot of people in my community were really interested in because I got questions about it all the time. And so I had to build a proposal after I was approached by a publisher. And the fortunate part of that was they already knew, a lot about me and my story. They let me keep the proposal very I think very trim compared to what I'm hearing from Marisa and Kody. I did not have a very in-depth proposal. I wrote out a chapter or two with a very brief description of where I wanted it to go and what I was going to talk about. And my publisher did a lot of the heavy lifting for me. And I don't think I could have navigated it being self-published. I think that this was the way that I was going to be able to share my story, because as a patient advocate, I have a lot of good days and I have a lot of bad days. I really needed someone who could be there to help me with this process. And as Kody had mentioned, it's not an easy process to learn about. So when I talk to other publishers, I feel very fortunate that I had the opportunity I did, because, a lot of people have a book ready to go. They have a story ready to share, and they're struggling to find someone to help them share it. So I do realize that I'm, very lucky to have that opportunity. And so for me, I just wanted to make sure that I utilized it, and I shared a story that I thought would help as many people as possible. So that's where, I kind of narrowed down the niche to talk about the workplace, and mostly about, disability and mental illness in the workplace, and how that affected me, and used my story to talk about things that otherwise, people struggle to open up about. So I was very lucky to have someone to help me market it and promote it and do all of those things and set up book signings and stuff like that. And they were really accommodating. They were incredibly helpful during that process, and I learned a lot. So now if I ever have to, write another book, I don't know if I would take on another book, but if I ever decided to, I know a lot more now about the industry and the process, just from learning about what, they had to do to help me, including the very painstaking editing process and promoting process.
And I just want to jump in because, Kody, you made me think of a couple of things. And also, Kody, when you were saying it's a hard industry to find information about. There's a lot of gatekeeping in publishing, but also, traditional publishing is not for the faint of heart. I think between agents and editors, think about editors at even the big five, maybe each editor picks 10 books a year to take on, but they're getting anywhere between like 50 and 100 proposals a week. So there is a extremely high rejection rate. And it's not because your writing isn't great or your topic isn't amazing. It's just they have 10 that they're allowed to choose, right? And they're going to choose that based on what are people looking for right now. And remember, they're thinking like 2 years ahead. So what is that landscape? What are they saying it's going to maybe look like 2 years from now? And that's sort of what they're thinking about in the back of their mind when they're picking those books. But also, I think that's why a lot of people choose even today, like, thank God we have the technology to self-publish. So there's over 4,000 books a day that come out on self-publishing platforms. And also traditional is mixed in with that, right? Not nearly as high as that number. And it's not that all these books are, incredible writing or like the best cover or have, a publisher behind them, but people are hungry to get their stories and their information out there. So when you hear 4,000 books a day, I think it sort of helps you in terms of you have to do a lot of marketing on your own. Your publisher is only going to help you to a certain extent, right? Because you're going against thousands and thousands of other books. If you want to learn more, I think when people are trying to decipher, okay, what type of book do I want to write? What are publishers picking up? If you really want to go the traditional route, and you need to have a lot of patience if that's the route that you go. But there's a great website. It's called Publishers Marketplace. A lot of agents use that website. You do have to pay for it every month. But when you're in there, you can look at every single day, every deal that is made from every publisher, small to the major 5, and what that book is about. You have advanced details. Who is the literary agent that sold it to that publisher? So if it is a book, say for Kody, that's in mental health, and they're like, this book sounds like something not exactly similar to mine, but this person is clearly interested in books like this, then you can click on their name and learn more about that agent. That might be the agent that you want to reach out to try to partner up with. But also, if you want to go that traditional route, you have to keep in mind too, the average advance, especially for a new author, is $0 to $5,000. And most authors never earn out their advance on their first book. It's just the way it goes. There's so many books that are out there, right? You're competing against a humongous market. So I think those are just some little things to keep in the back of your mind when you're trying to figure out, do I want to self-publish this or do I want to go traditional?
Right. We have another question about, for those who went with a more traditional publishing route. Vanda, who is a lupus patient and advocate, asks, for those who worked with publishers, did they accommodate your needs as a patient author, especially around energy levels fluctuating, needed promotion timelines, things like that? Did you find that you were able to flex and have a patient author kind of experience moving through the publishing?
Yeah, I'd love to start on that. So for me, I kind of touched on this in the last question. I was really surprised when I was approached to write my book. We had a very quick timeline and turnaround. So once again, this is where I felt like my journey through publishing was kind of unique. Marisa had talked about how long it can take. And I was kind of on the other end where they approached me. They kind of helped me figure out my topic and everything. And they said, hey, we want to have this done and edited by the end of the year, which gave me about 3 months to write a 50,000 word book. So like I had a very quick turnaround time. And as someone with severe mental illness, I cannot help but to have bad days. So in 3 months, having any sort of long-term illness or chronic illness, I have a lot of bad days in 3 months. And so that means I missed meetings and I missed deadlines and I really struggled to keep up. And there was several times where I expected that they were going to just drop my book and drop my project. And I received nothing but support. The person who I was working with at my publishing company constantly reached out to check on me when I wasn't doing well. They were and it wasn't about the deadline. They just wanted to make sure that, I was doing enough to keep myself going, because I was also really busy with, my speaking stuff and everything else I had going on as an advocate. And I think I was really shocked. I didn't expect to be accommodated, because I know that publishing is a very sought after thing, and getting a big publisher like I got I really didn't think that they would take the time to work with me on these different things, and I was pleasantly surprised. And not only that, but they gave me tips throughout the entire process when I was like struggling more, like if there was ways that I could get ahead in different areas through either the editing process or through some of the early writing process. They helped me navigate that too. So I was once again really lucky to have the publisher that reached out to me be someone who was really willing to accommodate me because they wanted to hear my story.
Yeah, I had probably somewhere in between that experience and also kind of struggling a bit with mine. And I think the biggest thing when I think back on the experience and kind of where I found it, I had more accommodations and found it very collaborative was with my editor. I can't say enough great things about my editor. And I think when your book is being picked up traditionally, it's kind of feels like it's kind of natural for them to be your best advocate because they're the person, especially if you're writing a memoir or kind of sharing your story, they connected with your story, right? They connected with your story and there's a reason why they picked it up. And so I found my editor that we had a really lovely dynamic and I really enjoyed working with her a lot. And there were areas that I struggled with, or like sometimes I didn't understand her choices, especially at the beginning, right? I'm not a strong writer. And when we did our first cut of my book through the editing process, there were things that got moved into places that I was like, that makes absolute no sense there. Like my brain couldn't connect because the timeline didn't connect anymore. And it like broke the emotional connection of what that moment was. And I struggled at that time because I thought, oh, great, this book isn't even going to be my story anymore when it comes out. But I learned at the beginning that that's kind of what the first edit is that, right? You're moving kind of big chunks, or you might be kind of really shaping it at that point. And so we kind of developed our relationship a little bit further. And I was able to voice like, whoa, that completely lost what that meaning was for me when we made that change. And because we had that personal connection, she had the connection to my story, she wanted to represent it well, we moved things around and we made it fit. I found her to be very, very accommodating to making sure that my book fit a story that could be relatable to the wide audience, but also didn't lose my voice in the process. And she made my story so much better. So I can't say enough great things about my editor. The process and the timeline I found to be a bit difficult. Being somebody who had stage 4 cancer, I started writing this about 2 years out from my diagnosis, and we still weren't quite sure what my kind of long-term prognosis would be. So my initial calls I really struggled with because they were looking to push my book. It was like a year and a half, I want to say, from when I was having these discussions with them, which was already like a year and a half into writing, before my book would be published. And that was really hard for me as somebody who had stage 4 cancer because I wasn't even sure if I'd still be alive. And that was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. I'm kind of tearing up in the process of, I had to voice that to them and say, one, I have stage 4 cancer advocates and patients that are in this book, that I wrote this book to kind of share our stories collectively together. And I want them to be able to see this. That was really important to me. But then also to be alive, to see my book out in the world. And so in order to get my publishing date pushed up, I had to agree to a very, very aggressive editing and writing timeline. And so we did move it up. So they were accommodating by moving up my publishing date. But that meant I felt like I was playing hot potato for at least a solid year of like, you go on a full sprint where all you're doing is writing and editing. That's like your entire life. You hit your deadline. And then I remember like pushing it over and like, okay, good. They're going to have it for a little while. I can recoup. And when my editor would come back like a week later, I'd be like, oh man, that was way too fast. You should have taken your time. And so it was a bit of playing hot potato. So I'll say like working with my editor, I had a lot of flexibility. When it came to public promoting and marketing and stuff like that, I definitely had much less leeway and flexibility. Because that was no longer working directly with my editor at that point.
Jump in really quick. I think for my memoir, the timeline was about 2.5 years from sale to shelf, which is longer, but not unheard of. I think like, especially with Kody, I mean, there are certain topics that a publisher will see, like this is a really growing topic. You want to strike while the iron's hot. So you're going to really try to get it done as quickly as possible. I'd say maybe a year. The quickest I've ever seen a book go to shelf for a client of mine was a year. And again, it was actually in the mental health space. And they wanted it to come out, timely as far as when that month of the year was, that people were already raising awareness and just a lot of things that publishers look at as far as time wise. But I think if you do go the traditional route, when you're negotiating your contract, you can ask them for more time as far as writing. Mine was originally 3 to 4 months. I pushed it to 6 months just because I had some personal things going on. And I knew if I go in a flare, that could take me down for a month or two, right? So I wanted to give myself a little leeway. I was, I had a good stretch. So I was actually able to get my book in 5 months. So it was a little early. But then there was like this period of literally nothing because you're waiting for them to edit it. And they're editing other books before yours, right? So then you hear nothing. So you're like, what's happening? But once the editing starts, you're on a little bit more of a quicker timeline to get your edits back. However, I think like Katie, I had an amazing editor and she dealt with chronic illness. She realizes I'm living with a chronic illness. Like there's only so much that we can do. Our body sometimes just takes control of the situation and you just have to ride that wave out. So she was very understanding as far as edits. I think probably the most stressful time for me was the book launch right before the launch and obviously the day before launch day and those couple of weeks after where you're doing media and things like that, like even not feeling well and even the good stress, for lupus kind of brings the lupus out and makes it go wild. But I had to show up for those things. I wasn't at 100%, but that's your day, right? That's your day that your book baby comes out into the world. So, I had just had to suck it up at that point because there was no way after 2.5 years I was missing that moment.
Two things that Katie said that I think are really important that I didn't even think to mention when I was talking through. Trusting the editing process is crazy if you've never written a book because you're watching someone hack away something you've just spent months putting together, and like they will either move stuff around or completely cut something, and that's hard. It's hard to watch like all that hard work get like moved around, and it ends up coming together so well. And I'm so happy with the editing process, and I'm glad I trusted them to do that because it came together better than what I would have been able to do on my own. But I also think it's important to advocate for yourself in another thing Katie said, which was not losing your voice. I know what my community talks about. I know the terminology my community uses. I'm aware of like how I need to talk about things. So a publisher, as great and knowledgeable as they are, they might not know some of the insides of your space or your community. So there were things I had to be like, hey, this isn't going to fit, or this isn't going to work, or this is why I put that in there. So I just wanted to acknowledge that because I think that was so well said. And I think both of those things I wouldn't have expected to have to consider when I was going in. Like the editing process was long and exhausting. It might have been harder than actually writing the book, in my opinion. And then like making sure that you keep your voice through that process can also be a challenge.
Yeah. I'm going to jump on that too, Kody. There was a phrase in my book that I used a lot that I couldn't tell my story without doing that. And when I got the edits, they changed it to a different word. Similar meaning, but it did not make sense. And I was just like, that's a non-negotiable for me because I personally cannot tell my story without that part in it. So it was like they were taking out the most special piece to me, and I didn't feel like I would negotiate at all. I would have probably given my advance back and just said, forget it, I'm going to take this and do something else with it. But they were amazing. And they understood because no one there on the team was living with lupus. And like Kody, like they didn't understand like what that day to day was. And we do have our own unique brand, like in our social, like online community, in our advocacy community, in our own language and our own voice. And you have to sort of just stay strong on holding that and let them know, like as soon as you can from the get-go, as you begin the conversations with publishers, that is crucial to you, that does not get lost in the process.
Yeah, I'll just chime in one last kind of thread on there of also that continues for if you do a audiobook or audio recording. I'll say I recorded my own audiobook and they wanted me to change the way certain things were said, which is not how they are said in the community at all. And so I had to really advocate for myself in those. I didn't win 100% of those battles, but it is a skill to learn to advocate for yourself And I think if you are a patient, you're used to doing that in a medical setting, and bringing that into your writing is really, really important as well, too, all the way through from writing to audiobooks and kind of on.
The last thing I'll say is like, I had to pick battles. Like there was some things I was like, hey, I'm not going to win this. But when it came to keeping my voice, one small thing for me was title. They wanted to go with something super generic. And I was like, hey, I came up with this title specifically around this topic and this idea. I think this will capture my community. This is what I would want to pick up off the shelf. And like, there were some things that I was like, you know what? I'm not going to fight hard on this because you guys probably are right about this. This isn't necessarily integrated into like my conversation or my community. And certain things I did have to, pick my battles on.
Okay, so you've written the book and you've published the book, and so then now what? I'd love to talk a little bit about the life after launch, the promotion and the balancing it all, especially with the realities of being a patient at the same time. Amanda, another advocate we've heard from before, wanted to also know, how do you promote your book while managing your health?
This is something I can talk about because my niche is social media. That's really largely what I had to depend on. There are two ways that I was really able to promote my book, and that was through social media and speaking events, because when I'm not doing social media, I am largely traveling and doing in-person speaking events, which is a really good opportunity to bring my book, sell my book, talk to people about the topic and whatnot. I relied heavily on reaching people through social media. And if you are a content creator, you know that promoting anything is hard because no algorithm wants you to be able to promote anything. So you really have to fight back. You have to find creative ways to talk about it. And I would say even like some less conventional way, like I am not going to be the person who is one of the speakers who is very professional all the time. Like my publisher knew when they reached out to me, I reach people in very different ways, whether that's through comedy, through humor, through trends. Like the way that I was going to promote my book wasn't going to be a traditional way that they might see from other publishers. And so the perk of that was, as a patient, I love content creation. It's something I can do on my own time, on my own schedule when I'm feeling good. If I'm feeling really good, I can record multiple episodes to release within several weeks. And so leading up to my publishing date and all that, whenever I was feeling well, I was able to record content and make videos about it. And when my book came out, I had a bunch of stuff ready to go. And it didn't have to put any more stress on me because it's something I was able to progressively work on. And using social media for me is my tool already. That's how I advocate. That's how I share my story. And so this was just how I reached people about my new part of my journey, which was my journey through being an author. So for me, it was largely just social media. I do now that, the newness of it has worn off. I've found that I'm spending a lot more time bringing it to events, and I'm spending a lot more time talking to people in both the mental health community and in the workplace community, like HR leaders, stuff like that. Now that it's, a little bit less new and it's been out for a bit, I'm really spending more time, I would say, like boots on the ground, like reaching people that way versus the initial push, which was social media and getting as many of my followers to check out my content, because I know those are the people who are going to be the most interested in it.
Yeah, I know for me, so marketing and promoting my book was actually one of the hardest parts for me. And it was definitely, as Marisa mentioned, that like portion right before the book comes out, that was actually very hard for me as well too. Both from when the book is coming out. So you've queued up, for me, I had like queued up speaking engagements and bulk buys and had all of this kind of momentum that was currently behind me that was taking up the vast majority of my time. And I felt like I didn't even have time to make social media posts at the moment. But also for me, writing my book was so much about helping other patients not feel alone. My biggest thing for social media for me is I've donated everything that I've ever made from social media. I donated the book deal. These were like, I never kind of wrote a book to make money myself. And so I found the promotion process really, really, really difficult because it felt like selling out in some kind of way. Like, even though I knew it wasn't, right? Like my people who follow me because they were with me through my entire story and they were excited about the book. But to me, it just felt like I don't want to be that person that's spamming you with my book and my content and all of that stuff. And it did, leading up to launch, I was kind of on a very aggressive marketing schedule that felt like pure spam. And so it was really hard for me on a personal level. And also just because that part doesn't come naturally to me as much. I mean, I think I've even made it through this entire podcast, and I actually don't think I've mentioned the name of my book yet. So that goes to show how terrible I am at it. It's called Too Young for Cancer. So I'll plug that before I completely fall flat on that. But I'll say the most surprising thing that I found after the book release was how quiet it was afterwards. You definitely have like the things that you've set up to do around launch day and those activities, but especially on launch day. I recognize that people just got the book. They're not going to have any feedback, right? But my brain did not compute that with how fast and how aggressive and how everything was just back to back to back. And especially when you get used to sharing on social media, like the feedback loop is very quick. And so I was actually surprised afterwards that after the book came out, how quiet or calm that like first couple days were while you're waiting for like, I've had this weird phase for the first like day or two afterwards where I was like, did everybody hate my book? I saw them posting photos with it and stuff like that, but like I didn't hear anything about the content of the book. Whereas I was getting reviews from NetGalley and all these other places, which felt regular, but they had been reading those books for longer, right? And so that was one of the things that I found surprising. And then I'll also just tie in, I didn't expect afterwards to have the people in my community and friends who I know supported me through my entire diagnosis, I know bought the book, but who probably also haven't read the book. Sometimes watching them try to navigate around not wanting to talk about the book because they don't want to admit that they haven't read it, where like, I don't care at all, right? Like, I know everybody doesn't have time to sit down and read a book, especially about a story you may already know. So I found that to be a very surprising kind of interesting thing afterwards too.
Well, that actually leads us into our next question, which is a wonderful one too for Kody and Marisa. And Katie, if you have anything else to add, what was the most surprising thing that you learned after your book was out into the world?
Well, so I don't know how to put this more than just writing a book is harder than I thought. And I'm not trying to insult other authors, but going into it, I was like, yeah, anyone can write a book. That's easy. Like, of course I can say I've done essays before. I've written 2,000 words. I can write 50,000 words. That's nothing. I don't think I really expected it to be a difficult thing to do. And I don't know how to describe it better than that. I went into it with the idea of like, oh, I got 3 months to do it. I got all the time in the world, not realizing I was actually on like a very short timeline compared to most authors. And I went into it with, I think, a little too much confidence. And it's not that I, doubt myself. It's not that I love how it turned out. It's just that it's a harder thing to do than I think most people would probably suspect. And so I do warn people that I have a lot of people ask me now, like, what was my main takeaway from being an author? And it's always that it's tough. It's really hard. And I've had people ask if I would be willing to write a second book. And my response is always definitely not right now, maybe in the future, but it takes a lot because you're pouring a lot of your time, a lot of your energy, a lot of your story into a very, condensed project. And so it's not only hard just because it's difficult things to do. It's hard because you want to be able to really be excited about it and be able to do promotions with it and be able to get people interested in it. And that just adds on to the list of things you have to do. By the end of it, I was happy that the book was coming out. I was like, all right, let's get this thing out. I kind of wanted to be done with it. As horrible as that sounds, I love the book. I love how it turned out. It's amazing. I'm so happy with it. But I was ready to be done with it. It'll be quite some time before I take on another project. So that's what I always want to tell people is if you're thinking about doing it, that's amazing. I think Marisa said earlier, everyone has a story to tell. I think her exact quote was, everyone has at least one book in them. And I would agree with that. I know a lot of advocates. I know a lot of people who have very amazing, interesting stories. But I want people to be aware it is a process and it is a huge thing to take on, especially if you're a patient advocate, because we already struggle so much day to day. We already have the ins and outs of our illness we're living with. And so to do all of that, just basic living and surviving and take on a book, it's a lot. So that's my thing is I just didn't expect how difficult it would be.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. It's a large undertaking. It can be very stressful. And I think, that pre-book launch and then book launch day and that month after, it's pretty intense. Then I feel like there's kind of a dip and almost like a little bit of a letdown because, things do go quiet, but the publisher, especially if you're traditionally publishing, they're going to push your book really hard those couple of months before. They're getting all the behind the scenes things at bookstores and sellers. Then you have media. And so then you're pushing your book for those couple of weeks after, but then they move on to their next book because they have so many on such a tight deadline. And then it really falls on you to continue the marketing of that. So it's, every time you're speaking, mentioning your books, can you sell your books there? I've had companies, say, well, we want to buy this many books from your publisher for people in the audience, right? So it's always like you're always marketing. And I feel like that doesn't end, but there are some little dips in it. The funny thing is, I think people think that the book is going to take off like wildfire right when it comes out. And yes, that might happen for a couple of books that we hear about that seem like they're everywhere in the news. And as soon as you walk into the bookstore, they're front and center. That's not the norm. I found that it was a good 2 or 3 years after that mine really started to take off, which was an interesting time frame. It might have had something to do that it was also during COVID when it came out, but it's like lupus awareness in itself became, I think, more prominent, and I started speaking more and doing bigger speaking engagements. So it's like all of a sudden it started to take off more than when I originally published it. But like Kody was saying too, I remember there was so much pressure with the traditionally published book versus my self-published book that I never wanted to go on my computer and write anything for a very long time after that. And I kept saying, like, I do not want to go through this process again. It was a lot. And after about 5 years, after that, I started to kind of get that itch again to write a book. And I'm actually on submission now for my next book. But there had to be a really long period of time where I did not want to see a Microsoft Word document at all.
Yeah, I'll just very shortly echo. I had all of the same feelings. I actually told my husband as I was like getting towards the end of my book of like, never let me write a book ever again. I actually said that, and I've had people who have told me like, oh, your next book. And I'm like, not happening. But it's one of those things that I completely echo that it's a ton of work. It's the worst like ROI, return on investment I have ever had in my life. While I didn't anticipate that when I was initially starting, it's also not why I wrote the book in the first place. So I think that kind of helped me continue through. I think of it a lot like skydiving. I went skydiving once many years ago, and I actually had a parachute kind of failure and I had to go through the backup. And so when I describe that experience, I say, I will never ever do it again, but I'm glad I did it once. And that's kind of how I feel about my book. I also don't think that I probably would fall into the I would never do it again category. While I say that now, I think I am in that period that Marisa mentioned of right now, it was just so much work that like I can't see myself doing it again immediately. I might become blind to that in a few years and get that itch again, but it is a lot of work. I'm really glad that both Kody and Marisa highlighted that because I don't know that that part is shared as much as some people kind of just glamorize the process and getting a book out in the world.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the ROI comment because, people will come to me as an agent and in their initial query letters are saying like, I know this book is going to make millions, like, and it's so focused on the money. And I'm like, if that's why you're writing this book, you will most likely be severely like disappointed at the end of the day. Most books sell maybe between 100 and 1,000 copies. But if you're doing it because you have this burning desire to get this story out, and whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and you want to help people, or you just want to leave something behind for the people that are coming after you that are getting diagnosed and feel like they're completely alone, like then your return on investment is going to be incredible, like doing it for that reason. But I always tell people, like, when the money is the first mention to me, I'm like, if you're doing this for money, you are absolutely in the worst industry and it's not going to, work out well for you. Because we hear about those outliers of people that, wind up getting a 10-book deal and a movie made and all of these things. Like that's the rarity in the publishing world.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your stories, your wisdom, and your time today and talking about this process. We're going to, if you're tuning in, make sure that you check out each of their social media handles and the links to their books that we've included here too. And just as a reminder for everybody else too that's tuning in, nothing here today is shared should be considered any kind of medical advice. We're not promoting any products or manufacturers. Always consult your physician before trying anything new. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I encourage you to become an insider at theinsiders.com. for more stories and insights from our advocate community. And don't forget to follow each of these amazing advocates on Instagram and continue to learn about their work. Thank you again all for joining us. And until next time, keep advocating and keep sharing your stories. We're all here to listen. If you're new to The Insiders, make sure you join our community at theinsiders.com, where you can get paid to share your healthcare stories, and be sure to follow us on socials. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.